Our first item today is our 2010 Exemplary Program Awards, and I believe I'm calling up Jane Patton from the Academic Senate to present those.
And the money man. And the money man.
Yeah, San Paul Lanning, with something in his pocket, it appears.
That's Santa.
Thanks.
You have one for me?
Thanks.
That's it. I'm accepting them.
Yeah. Well, it's always wonderful to start the day with such a positive presentation. And I must confess, I only touched base with one of the colleges, and I'm hoping that they're all here because some of the folks, I think, are coming in at different times. So if we don't have them all, I may need to finish some later, or would that be okay? Okay, thank you. The Academic Senate is always delighted to participate in the selection of the exemplary programs. You know that every college in the state does innovative, wonderful things, and this is an opportunity to highlight just a few of them each year. This year we've identified 2 exemplary programs, and we have 2 programs that we'd like to award honorable mention to. First, I'd like the representatives from Los Medanos and Mount San Antonio to come forward. And I saw the Los Medanos folks, but I don't know if, I fear that Mount Sac folks may not have arrived yet, thinking that the item would be later on the agenda, I think. So we'll begin with, did you want to push it off? No.
No, we're all set.
Okay, great. So, thank you for coming forward. With us today, we have David Kale, the Program Director, and Michael Norris, the Academic Senate President, and Jim Martin, the Outreach Director at the college, Los Medanos College. A critical function of California community colleges, as you know, is workforce preparation. And in this economy, we are all clear that it's more important than ever for colleges to forge alliances with business and industry and with government agencies. The Process Technology Center at Los Medanos College has partnered with Contra Costa County and the U.S. Department of Labor to prepare students for careers as plant operators in the refining and chemical industries. Because of its most successful partnership to train local workers, we are recognizing Los Medanos College with an honorable mention as an exemplary program. Will you join me in thanking them? So I would like to present the plaque to them, and I think this is a photo op. If you'd like to come over to the center, I know the Chancellor and Paul Lanning from the foundation, as well as our board president, would like to all join together. So we'll sort of be a choir and turn sideways. Only one female, wow. So we have a couple people, I think, who were, there we go. I'm sorry. That's okay, sorry. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations.
Very good.
Congratulations on this program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And did Mount San Antonio College arrive yet? Okay. Let me ask if the other ones have arrived yet. Is Chaffee College here? And how about Mira Costa? Okay, great. So the program director was unable to come today, but we're still going to award, let's maybe come over towards the center, Mira Costa College with their presentation for the exemplary programs. So this is the first of 2 exemplary programs. We all know across the state and across the country how the price of textbooks has absolutely skyrocketed. And the lack of having a textbook can really be the difference between a student succeeding or failing in their classes. Mira Costa's textbook lending program provides semester-long loans to students, of course at no cost, and Mira Costa has attracted an array of grants to fund their program. Something that I found particularly interested in their program is that they also include loans of other items such as calculators and graduation regalia, which can really add up to some extra funding for students. The students also get special one-on-one assistance about getting financial aid, which also is so critical to many of our students. Mira Costa's program is one that's easily replicable at other colleges, and because the program provides students with the tools that they need, we're delighted to award them the Exemplary Program Award. Will you join me in congratulating Mira Costa? And I'm not sure if we have any photographers for this one. So I think we can move forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I will.
You okay if we do this? Okay, great.
Just like to note that Mira Costa is a San Diego County college. And Jane, just let me know when the others are here, and we're happy to break in. Okay, with that, we are going to go to our state budget update. As all of you know, we received some, what I would say is very devastating news yesterday regarding community college budget. In reading the documents, it is a bit complicated to understand, so I have asked Eric to be as succinct and direct as possible in explaining to us what is happening and actually how the mechanisms are intended to work here. With that, Vice Chancellor Skinner.
Good morning, President Himmelstein, Chancellor Scott, members of the Board of Governors. I will step through a brief overview of the Governor's budget proposal that came out yesterday. I will try to keep it high level and kind of key on the big points, and then I'm available for any kind of discussion or conversation or questions you have. From a high level perspective, it is a very difficult budget proposal for essentially every sector of the state budget. Governor Brown had foreshadowed that and asked people to prepare to sit down when they read about this budget, not to stand up and buckle their seatbelts. And so he broadcast ahead of time, and I think the proposal that came out yesterday lived up to that billing. And the package that he presented includes $12.5 billion in cuts, $12 billion in new revenues, and about $1.9 billion in some other solutions that don't fit in those categories. And so this proposal is again based on the assumption that they'll be able to get voter approval of roughly it's actually I think $9 billion that will go to the voters, another $3 billion in revenue solutions that they could adopt at the state level, so in a lot of ways I think this should be characterized as a best case scenario in the sense that if those other revenues don't come through, the choices just get much tougher. So that said, the $12.5 billion in cuts affect virtually every sector of this budget. The K-12 is the one notable exception. They are not queued up for any additional cuts in this budget proposal, and Governor Brown explained that by saying that K-12 had borne the brunt of the cuts up till this point, and therefore that's his rationale for not proposing further cuts for K-12. I think in fairness, many other sectors of the budget have taken deep cuts already, the colleges not least among them, and so perhaps there's a layer of political strategy in this as well in terms of keeping K-12 on board as they seek additional revenues, and keeping CTA on board as the governor seeks additional revenues from the people. So it's very likely a political dimension, and the governor's signaling a political strategy as much as anything in this proposal. So the cuts. Let me just jump into the community college portion of the budget. Obviously there are cuts in health and social service programs, and there's some very brutal cuts on those fronts. Within the community colleges, the key features are no mid-year cuts. That's welcome news. One thing you often hear from districts is it's when the budget plan gets changed in midstream when it's most difficult to adjust to. The planning horizon just is brutal if you pull the rug out from under during the middle of the year. So that was a positive feature. The next feature isn't so positive. It's a $400 million base cut to our apportionments, to our general purpose funds. That equates to roughly a 6%, closer to 7%, about 6.9% reduction in our apportionments. And the $400 million proposal is described in the governor's budget as it's the administration's intent to work with the Board of Governors and the Chancellor and other stakeholders in the system to structure that cut in a way that is got a little feedback on the mic there, I think. To structure that cut in a way that changes our funding model. Should we take a break here, or just the? All right. Well, I'll just keep going here. So the $400 million cut would be, the administration states its desire to work with the system to develop reforms in our funding model to incentivize course completion, degree and certificate attainment, and I would say that the way those policy goals are described in the governor's budget proposal, they throw a lot of ideas up in the air, and I think it's going to take some further conversation, sitting down with them to see exactly what they have in mind. But what's crystal clear about it is that the dollars associated with that change would be a $400 million cut in our apportionments. The other key feature of this budget for the colleges is the $10 per credit unit fee increase. That would take the credit fee up to $36 per unit. That's roughly a 38% increase in our student fees. That would generate an estimated $110 million in additional revenues. And what the governor's proposing with those revenues is essentially, and it actually is a kind of a multi-part, there's a kind of a technical dimension to this, but I think the best way to understand it is the administration is proposing using that $110 million in additional revenues to fund enrollments. So they would fund a 1.9% enrollment growth, which is about 22,700 full-time equivalent students, or about 50,000 students on a headcount basis. So that additional fee revenue is effectively used to fund that enrollment growth. There's one more feature I'll note, which is an additional deferral of funds. There's a proposal to add to the inter-year deferral that the colleges have lived with over the last better part of the last decade, I guess, and the governor's proposing adding $129 million to that inter-year deferral, so that'll push monies that should be paid to colleges this year. I mean, rather in the budget year 2011-12, because that's when the proposal's for, takes $129 million that otherwise would go to the colleges next year and pushes them till the following year, 2012-13. And so that would bring our inter-year funding deferral to $961 million, so pushing $1 billion in inter-year deferrals. And that's a bookkeeping maneuver that really achieves a one-time savings, is what it does, is by pushing part of the state's liability for 2011-12 into the following year. They're going to pay that bill a little bit late. And then in order to sustain that over time, then they will continue that deferral in subsequent years so that they'll never escape that liability, but on a one-time basis, they've delayed it. So that's definitely in the category of smoke and mirrors, but that's part of what's built into this budget. And I should note on the K-12 side, there's an addition to their deferral of roughly $2.1 billion, proportionally even a little larger than our 129, although, of course, they're not queued up for the cuts that we are. So those are the key features, and again, I'd underscore this budget proposal is assuming $12 billion in additional revenues. The lion's share of those would simply be extending current tax increases, current taxes that are in place now, temporary taxes. That's the lion's share of the revenues the governor proposes, but there are a couple other changes as well that are built in on the revenue side. I could go into that if there are any questions, but that's the extent of kind of the big picture perspective, and I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Eric, for keeping on top of this like you have, and for your direct comments. I know the Chancellor would like to speak before I open it up to board member questions and comments.
Well, I too want to thank Vice Chancellor Skinner for his presentation. It's great to have someone in the office as capable as he is, and he and I have worked together on budgetary matters, and we were able to meet prior to the revelation of this budget with the Director of Finance and two other members of the Finance Department. Let me make several comments. The first comment is that I have real resistance to the idea of merely changing the census date. And there are reasons for that, and I made it rather clear when I met with the Director of Finance, which actually, unfortunately at that time, the proposal was even more detailed than it is now. The only thing that we might have succeeded in was at least opening it up for discussion. And let me explain to you why that I think it is unfortunate to make one sweeping change in order to save money, and really at the expense of the community college. If you were to move the census date, we'll say from the 4th week to the 12th week, you would save money. There's no question of that, because we do have attrition. We have incidentally reduced that attrition during the last 5 years, and we have formed this special task force with the idea in mind that we're going to look at other ways of improving student success. But if you move and you simply reward colleges on the basis of completion, let me cite at least 3 reasons why this could have some unfortunate, maybe unintended consequences. In the first place, it would penalize colleges in the inner city areas more than it would suburban colleges. They deal with a more vulnerable student body, and they therefore have a higher attrition rate. So through no fault of their own, they would receive less money, or they would be penalized more sharply than would colleges in the higher income suburban areas. Secondly, it would have the unintended consequences of saying to colleges, you need to schedule courses that have a very high completion rate. Obviously, ceramics has a higher completion rate than accounting does. So you have an incentive for a college to say, well, let us schedule those classes that have higher completion rate. Third, you place an incentive for a teacher to say, don't encourage anybody to drop out, give them an F instead. Now, all teachers on occasions come across students whom they believe are not going to be able to complete a course successfully. And so perhaps midway through the course, they say to the student, you know, it might be better for you to drop out, take a W, which will not hurt your grade point average, and come back and study this, study in the meantime, and take this course again when you're better prepared. So there are a lot of unintended consequences in this, which I have sometimes described as using an axe instead of a scalpel. So if I must say that I will, as well as some other community college advocates, say, let us look at this with a great deal more perception and care. If we had a host of indices that we used to improve student success, that might be the way to do it. And maybe completion rate might be one of these indices. By the way, the state of Washington gives some funding on the basis of performance. But for, in other words, what they're really saying is, community colleges, we want you to do more with less. If they are going to cut us this sharply, what we must do is simply say we will educate fewer students because we want to educate them with quality. And we will look at that and try to do that. But to constantly say, well, you know, 2 years ago they cut our entire categorical programs by 40%. That's the support to our programs. In other words, making it more difficult for us to help students to complete, reducing the number of counselors, tutors, making cuts to EOPS programs and other things. And now to turn around and say, well, we're going to give you some extra money, but increase your enrollment. But, oh, by the way, that $400 million that you're going to cut out, no, don't decrease your enrollment as a result of that. We are not standing here saying that we are unwilling to take our share of cuts. We understand that the state's in a bad position, but we do want to maintain the quality of our education. And we're going to seriously look at, in our studies, in our Student Success Task Force, of ways, without additional money, that we can improve success. But that's a very complex problem. That's not something you can do with just simply say, well, we'll change the census date, and thereby, if you change the census date, of course, we would have to increase more students at the beginning. Remember, to be honest, when you schedule the cost of a class, whether, say, 10% of the students drop out or not, the expense is exactly the same. It doesn't decrease your expenses because a student drops out. You still have to pay a teacher's salary. You still pay counselors. You still have to sweep the floors and light up the buildings. So of course, I regret deeply that we're going to have to take a $400 million cut. But I also have to say that I resent them coming in at a time when they're saying, we're going to cut you, but we're going to place on you these kind of what I consider not thought through reforms. So if you hear that the Chancellor stood up in front of a legislative committee and objected to the plan, you heard right.
Okay, well said, Chancellor. Board member comments, Mr. McDougall.
I'd like to ask the Chancellor if in making cuts to the University of California and the California State University, were there any similar types of conditions imposed upon those systems by the legislature that affects the way they do business? And if not, why are community colleges singled out in this particular way and not, as you indicated, just given the cuts and enable us to determine how we can educate perhaps fewer students but maintain quality?
Well, to answer that question, I would simply say no. And I might point out that in my discussions with the Department of Finance, I asked the same question. Are you placing the same kind of rules on the University of California and CSU? Well, no, we're not. And maybe one of their rationales is we have a higher attrition rate. We certainly do. But I can tell you, if we had the kind of admission criteria that the freshman class at the University of California at Berkeley has, we'd have a lower attrition rate also. The state of California says to us, come one, come all. We take 100%. A student can, if a student graduates from high school with a 1.5 grade point average, they can come to a community college. They can't come to the University of California or to CSU. So we're willing to take on that responsibility. In fact, we are eager to take on that responsibility. That's one of the things that we pride ourselves in. But maybe to use a crude illustration, that would be like saying an oncologist has a higher mortality rate than a dermatologist. Therefore, an oncologist is not doing his or her job as well as a dermatologist. Well, an oncologist deals with more difficult patients, as you know, with more higher rate, possibility of mortality. So I'm just trying to say this is a, now I want to say something here. This is the governor's proposed budget. This is not an enacted budget. And I believe that we have friends in the legislature who will be sympathetic to what we have to say, because they have an understanding of the community college, some of whom actually have been community college trustees or community college teachers. So they have a better understanding, I think, than the Department of Finance.
Vice Chancellor Skinner.
I just wanted to elaborate on the UC and CSU cuts. I think it is worth noting here that the cuts to the University of California and CSU were both at the $500 million level, which is a deeper cut than ours, given their base budgets are smaller. So they are brutal cuts, but the Chancellor was right on target. There's no comparable policy proposal to change their funding model. In my conversations with the Department of Finance yesterday, they signaled that they wanted to talk with UC and CSU about ways of achieving efficiencies and cost savings, and they seemed to imply that was in the direction of perhaps salary takebacks as the way that they could minimize impact on students, but that wasn't an explicit part of the proposal. And then I also wanted to add, just as we wrestle with this $400 million cut and the way it's structured, you know, I'm less optimistic that we'll be able to change the magnitude of the cut, and that's unfortunate. Our system's underfunded. We've taken deep cuts. We haven't received a cost of living adjustment for 3 years running. All those things have eroded our ability to offer training and education. And so that's brutal. That it looks like we are going to have to face a cut on the magnitude of that $400 million number. But I'm more optimistic that we'll be able to fight back the policy dimensions of that, and particularly with the Student Success Task Force that's just launching now, I think we'll be able to make that case that that's a more appropriate venue to bring a thoughtful approach to bear on these issues of student success, and that if we've got to take a cut in the short term, let's find the way to structure that minimizes negative impacts. But let's not make matters worse by throwing some bad policy on top of a brutal cut. So I think that it kind of signals where I think we're going to be heading with our advocacy. And again, we'll work to minimize the cut if we can at all pull that off. But it's this train's going to be moving rapidly. They're talking. Governor Brown wants to wrap up the budget deal by March 1st, so as to have time to take the revenues to the voters in June. The signal we got yesterday in our briefing was that the budget document itself may not be voted on by March 1st, but what they want to lock down are the cut proposals. They want to get the commitments on the savings, and they want to get the commitments on, again, taking the revenue measure to the voters. Those are the pieces that need to be locked in by March 1st, and so that train's moving. It's going to be moving very, very rapidly. Budget hearings will start as early as late this week. I think we're still waiting to hear the schedule, but we'll start seeing the overview hearings scheduled very, very shortly here.
Member Baum?
First off, I think the proposals also underline the continued focus that we've adopted as a board on advocacy and education, and taking every opportunity we can to articulate the impact on the system of the cuts, and also the impact of proposed reforms. So that's a responsibility we all share in all of our interactions. In addition to the cuts to the system, what will be the impact on the Chancellor's office and the ability to support the districts? And I saw it. Does that mean also the 10% salary reduction? How does that impact all the employees at the Chancellor's office as well?
That is worth noting. Essentially, the state government dimensions to the governor's proposal is he accepted the savings that were built into the recently negotiated collective bargaining agreements. So the majority of state unions had agreed to terms that lowered their compensation through both a combination of an unpaid day off every month, a personal leave day, and additionally a greater employees' contribution towards retirement. And so that amounts to roughly an 8% pay cut. That's what SEIU, representing our employees, negotiated. That's the extent of what Governor Brown scored in his budget proposal. So there are no additional cuts beyond that. What he did include in the proposal was, he said for the state unions that have not yet settled, he is going to impose similar levels of savings on those bargaining groups, and I guess obviously leave it to the negotiations to figure out exactly how that'll be structured. But the good news in this budget from an agency perspective is there were not additional cuts on the Chancellor's office.
Okay. Because we still have a number of unfilled positions within the Chancellor's office too. How will that impact those?
We have been, as Chancellor Scott pointed out, I think it was at the board retreat, we have been cautious as an agency to try to keep a certain amount of a cushion there. I think, again, the good news in this governor's budget is it didn't get worse for us. And we will fill those positions as they're critically important, while also trying to maintain a certain amount of a buffer, as any organization should probably have a little bit of a cushion, and that's the best way for us to structure a cushion. We're going to continue to be understaffed as an agency. That's not going to change. I think we're maybe looking at the glass half full, though. Here, it's not getting worse. And I thought, I think we had some fears that we might have seen an extra 10% or an extra 20% cut to our agency. Governor Brown cut the governor's budget by 25, his governor's office budget by 25%. And I think so. Again, that's the good news, is it didn't get worse for us in yesterday's proposal.
Member McDougall.
Yeah, the answer to this question may seem obvious, but I'll ask it anyway. If the tax increase is not approved in June, are the implications basically doubled for what we see here? That's the question. And if the answer is similar to that, I think it's really important that we understand very early what the consequences will be if that tax increase is not approved. Because
Absolutely. Well, yesterday during his press conference, the governor was asked that exact question. What happens if the revenues don't pass? And he essentially dodged the question, and he said, I think his comment was something along the lines of, the choices get far more draconian, and Draco was not a very nice executive chief executive, I think, something along those lines. You know, he threw a little humor in there, but the choices get a lot worse. He did not really explain what those were. He punted the question over then to his director of Department of Finance. She didn't go into a lot of detail either. So I think that the point you raise is critically important on a couple levels. One is it's important for us to understand what are the consequences of the revenues not being adopted. I think just from a strategic and a planning perspective, that's important for us to know. We don't have the answers. I think your guess about doubling the magnitude of the cuts is probably about as good a guess as you could apply to the matter. So that's one dimension. The other important dimension, though, is a political one, which is the proposition of trying to go to the voters and get them to adopt, again, the $9 billion that's going to be on the ballot. Is going to be a tough sell in this environment. I think everybody who pays any attention to this issue and kind of voter sentiment knows that it's going to be an incredibly tough sell. And so that, I think then that also raises the matter of how are the voters going to understand what that consequence is? You know, how's that going to be illustrated to them of what does a no vote mean in June? And how's that going to impact their schools? How's that going to further impact higher education? How's that going to impact corrections, public safety, parks, health, human services, but understanding what the implications of not having the revenues, I think it's critically important from the campaign perspective. And honestly, it wasn't very clear to me yesterday from the responses how this administration, and I assume the Democrats and legislature, will mount that campaign. Because I think telling that story is going to be an incredibly important piece of motivating voters on this.
Other board member comments? You have another question?
I do. I don't have a question, but I have a comment, and my comment is related to the paper that the Chancellor provided us with at the end of the day yesterday that talks about the cuts, but talks about education as an investment, goes through the efficiencies of the California community colleges in helping to produce graduates, what the return on that investment is to the state of California. And I think it's a method of presenting this that is extremely important for all of us to be very much aware of, and for the colleges to have good information on. And that was as fine a outline of it as I have seen. And I would just encourage broad-based distribution of that, and also actions on the local levels that will help to educate our local communities as to viewing this not as an expense, but as an investment. And it's extremely important, because nothing is of greater importance as an investment today than that. So,
Well said. Any other board member questions? Let me, if I might, just make a couple of comments. One, Eric, basically the bottom line in this is you have a $400 million cut, but we're getting $110 million to fund increased enrollment in classes. And so the governor's office in this proposal, if it's enacted, is saying basically serve more kids and find the other $300 million in cuts somewhere else. So it has the, and maybe I'm wrong, but to me it seems that it only can come from a few places, where maybe there's a lot of them, but it's employee salary rollbacks. Maybe there's less counselors, whatever it is, but you've got to find it somewhere. Is that basically simply the formula that's presented, or the direction?
That's essentially it.
Yeah.
We'd be asked to serve more students, but at a lesser funding rate is one way to think about it. And so in order to serve students at a lesser funding rate, you've got to cut your cost of business. And so you take money back from your employees, you fire employees. You know, those are the basic cost drivers here. Yeah.
So, we're looking at potentially devastating impacts on our employees and programs. Vice President Perez.
I have a follow-up question, and if you can help clarify for me. But the process of educating our students, better utilizing technology, having better systems, you know, to actually admit students into the system, the assessment costs, things of that nature, is that part of this as well? Do those take into consideration? Because my recommendation would be, don't cut counselors, don't look at cutting your staff, but instead look at efficiencies in your overall operating and how you're actually operating the overall college itself. There might be opportunities to create efficiencies there that we haven't yet vetted. So is that the same bucket of funding?
I think those efficiencies are potential ways of lowering your cost of production, but I think the challenge there is the time frame. If our colleges are going to take a $400 million cut starting, you know, effective next fall, and not only a $400 million cut, but also another $129 million in funding that's going to get pushed out the tail end of next year, it's achieving, you know, implementing those kind of reforms you're talking about takes time. And so I think, in fairness, colleges have been migrating towards those efficiencies, and you know, you can point to multiple examples, whether it's SB 1440 or increased use of automation in some of the student services functions, increased use of distance education, although that's not always a cost saver. Distance ed sometimes can be more expensive, but those kinds of changes have been happening over time, but it's difficult, if not impossible, to implement a whole new slate of those, say, in a 6-month time frame in order to accomplish the cut. So in the short run, it's unfortunately going to be those other kind of staffing cuts, most likely, the districts are going to have to employ to achieve the savings.
Sometimes, unfortunately, we're our worst enemy when it comes to time. And I would hope that people would expedite some of those changes based on the timeline and not take a longer time to create another study or create another task force. We have the data. We should start implementing today. Don't put it off for tomorrow. That would be my recommendation.
Chancellor Scott.
I will point to one efficiency that has already happened, and that is we have larger class sizes. We went from an average of 29 to 31. In most of our colleges, over 95% of their classes are filled to capacity. In other words, there are, like in the case of career technical education, you have just so many stations if you are dealing with auto mechanics or nursing. In some cases, you have the size of the classroom. So we are at the highest number of students per faculty that we've ever had. As I said, we actually went from 29 average class to 31 average class, much higher than what you would find in the senior institutions, for instance. They do not have that large a class size. So that's an efficiency that we've already implemented. There's not a lot of room for us to increase that, you know. We might get it up to 32 or something like that, but that's obviously saving money. That means our faculty's working harder, and so that's an efficiency. We have the highest rate of the 3 segments of public higher education in terms of the number of students enrolled in distance education. We certainly continue to increase distance education, and we'll look at other efficiencies. I mentioned, for instance, that Butte College has now become energy independent. So we're looking at things like that to reduce energy costs and so forth. So we will work on those efficiencies. We allow that to happen at the local level. We are in other words, as we don't go from the Chancellor's office, we don't go and analyze the course schedule and say to local colleges, we have neither the staff nor would we find them very receptive to our taking on that task. But we are going to, you know, obviously the colleges will do the best they can with the scarce money that they have. But I just have to say once again that whether the legislature is open to our recommendations or not, I will simply say we cannot call upon the college to continue to do more and more with less and less. Our cost per student is lower than K through 12, certainly than it's half the cost per student of CSU and 1/3 the cost of UC, or even more. So we are the most cost efficient per FTES, that is per full-time student equivalent, of any educational system in the state of California. But we'll continue to work on these issues, and I think there's going to be some very creative solutions that are going to happen at the campus level.
Member Mehmet.
Can you just repeat your distance education numbers that you mentioned?
I'm kind of pulling it off the top of my head, I'll have to confess, but as I recall, it was something over that we have that over 10% of our students are taking distance education of some kind. Some take one course, some take all their courses.
Okay.
But that's, and I could get that number. I don't know whether, Patrick, do you have a number, or am I incorrect? I was just, yes.
It's FTES, not students. 10% of our FTES is distance ed, and that's higher than CSU.
Patrick is
10%.
headcount's up over 15%.
FTEs are distance.
Thank you.
Member Reed.
FTEs.
Do you have any idea on how many districts that presently might be facing some form of insolvency as a result of this $400 million cutback?
Good question. Yeah.
Half a dozen, maybe?
Yeah, you know, that's always a difficult process. It's at best an imperfect science of, you know, trying to assess where districts are, and you know, the unfortunate pattern is, it's, you know, districts are doing everything they can to hold out, to, you know, to build their dike up, you know, keep the flood from coming in and inundating them, and they're doing that in real time. And oftentimes they're using strategies that are as unfortunately as almost as shaky as what the state does sometimes in terms of temporary solutions, borrowing. They're doing what they can to survive, and so oftentimes when that fails, it's more of a abrupt change. So I don't really have a hard number or an estimate for you. We've got a small handful of districts that we're working with on a weekly and monthly basis, keeping tabs on where they're at. Those are, and at this point, that list has not, you know, has not mushroomed. I guess it would be my professional judgment that if we have to take another $400 million in cuts, we'd probably push another 3, 4, 5 districts into the red zone in terms of danger, where they're having to take more extreme local actions in order to, you know, their budgets would be in an extremely precarious position. But that's only a guess.
I'll turn it over to the Vice President for public comment.
We have public comment from Jonathan Lightman. Representing the Faculty Association.
Thank you, Mr. President, Chancellor, Vice Chancellor, and members. I first want to thank Vice Chancellor Eric Skinner for his leadership, and I know that we've all tremendously benefited from his briefings and his cooperative spirit in keeping all of us on the same page. I do want to make sure that we are clarified in terms of the proposal. It's a $400 million proposed cut. The money for growth is paid for by an increase in student fees, so that's not included within that $400 million. The implications of this budget are very serious, and I know you all understand that. I do want to also add a statement to the Chancellor's list of reasons why this change in census date is not positive, and that is the newfound emphasis on career technical education. These are programs that can get people from unemployment to employment quickly. And we need to allow students the opportunity sometimes to experiment and to see even if they have the physical capacity for taking on a certain course challenge. I know our president, John McDowell, has pointed to a program at Los Angeles Trade Technical College in pole climbing, where these lead to tremendous jobs at PG&E and other utilities around the state. Sometimes a student enrolls and realizes that they just simply don't have the strength to do it. But we do want to encourage students to try these programs and to see if they're appropriate for them. The reason why I asked to speak to you today is that every single year there are questions about what the Board of Governors can and should be doing, and I know several of you expressed this concern. What Eric mentioned before about the implications of a budget initiative not passing are extremely serious. But as he also noted correctly, we do not know if this can qualify for the ballot, because in order to go through the legislative process, the thinking, at least right now, is that it does require a 2/3 vote. We have already asked all the leaders in the Faculty Association, and we've also communicated this to the students and to other associations, to right now, today, be writing on what's called the blogosphere to drive the story about the need to qualify this initiative. We don't have to discuss the need to pass the initiative. We have to first take the step of qualifying. This is a democratic process in a democratic environment. Voters need to be given the opportunity to weigh in. You all know the implications of why this is important, and to the extent that you as leaders can educate your communities and help drive the story, it's much better than having the story being driven for us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vice Chancellor Skinner. Excellent work once again. I'm going to ask Jane Patton to come up again because we have one of our award winners here now.
Hello again. I understand that our representative from Chaffey College has arrived, and if he could please come forward. This is Ricardo Diaz, the program director at Chaffey College, and Chaffey is the recipient of one of the Exemplary Program Awards today. Glad you could make it. So let me tell you a little bit about the program at Chaffey. Chaffey College is an Hispanic serving institution, and the superintendent president, Henry Shannon, indicates that their Opening Doors program is a nationally recognized, innovative, and collaborative project which has a cascading impact on probationary students otherwise bound for academic dismissal. By employing strategies in instruction, in counseling, orientation, and support services, the Chaffey College program, called Opening Doors, has saved potential dropouts and turned them into success stories. We are enthusiastically presenting the Exemplary Program Award to Chaffey College today. Congratulations.
Paul's not here. She's got it. She's got it.
Really,
It was not Chancellor, by the way. It looks a little bit like it was off.
And the next award is for Mount San Antonio College, and I believe Erica Ledesma has arrived. Could you please come forward? Thank you. Well, so glad you could make it. So let me tell you a little bit about the program at Mount San Antonio College. Mount SAC identified a need and developed a solution. It's called the WIN program. It targets the academic needs of student athletes. The Senate President from Mount San Antonio College wrote that the WINS program's combination of high expectations, quality tutoring, counseling, support, and frequent progress reports create a collaborative support network for the student, which has already been used as a model at several other community colleges. Because the students in the WIN program have increased their GPA and their retention and success rates, we are happy to present Mount San Antonio College an honorable mention as an exemplary program. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Jane, and congratulations to all of our winners.